It's strange how quickly your life can be split into two parts, the before and the after. For Maria Jennings, the before was a quiet evening in Brookdale, a typical working-class suburb in the Midwest. She'd just put her kids to bed, folded laundry that smelled faintly of detergent and the lingering smoke from the neighbor's grill, and sat down with a cup of tea that she probably wasn't going to finish. Nothing extraordinary. She had a rhythm, a kind of survival autopilot most single parents run on. Work, kids, bills, exhaustion. That was her. The after began with the sound of raised voices drifting in from next door. It wasn't unusual. The man who lived there had a reputation. Loud arguments, different people coming and going at odd hours, the kind of things that make neighbors shake their heads, but not call the cops because no one wants to get involved. Still, the shouting that night felt sharper, more urgent, and Maria found herself stepping onto her porch just to make sure it wasn't spilling into her yard. That's when she saw him, Detective James Carter, storming out of the house. She knew him by sight. Everyone in Brookdale did. He was one of the town's good cops, the kind who got his picture in the paper after a big drug bust, the one who shook hands at fundraisers and wore his uniform like armor. But that night, he didn't look like the polished hero people clapped for at parades. He looked rattled. His face was pale, jaw tight, shoulders bunched up like he was carrying something heavier than his own skin. He muttered something under his breath, climbed into his car, and sped off without noticing her dot. Maria hesitated. Should she call someone? Her gut said something was off, but her head reminded her, you don't tangle with cops in this town. You keep your head down, keep your kids safe, and you mind your business. So she went back inside. A few minutes later, she heard it, the scream. Sharp, panicked, and then cut off. That sound would replay in her head 1,000 times in the days to come, but in that moment, it jolted her forward. She grabbed her phone, dialed 911, and within 10 minutes, the street was filled with red and blue flashing lights. She didn't know it yet, but by calling for help, she just painted a target on her own back. The scene was chaos. Officers rushed in, paramedics too late to do anything but pronounce a time of death. Neighbors gathered in clusters on lawns, whispering and craning their necks to catch glimpses. Maria stood outside her house in slippers, hugging herself against the night air, trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when Carter reappeared, sliding back onto the scene as if he hadn't already been there. His face was different now, controlled, professional, the mask back in place. He moved with authority, directing others, taking notes. He didn't look at her, but she could feel the weight of his presence like a hand on her back. The investigation didn't take long to veer sideways. Officers scoured the house, bagged evidence, asked questions. Maria answered what she could. Yes, she'd heard shouting. Yes, she'd seen Carter leave. Yes, she was the one who called 911. But something shifted in the way they looked at her when they came out holding a crumpled towel with bloodstains on it. Is this yours? One asked. Her stomach dropped. It was. She recognized it instantly, cheap, faded, one of the old kitchen rags she'd tossed in the trash that morning. But how the hell had it ended up in her neighbor's living room? She stammered out confusion, denial, insisting it wasn't possible, but it was too late. Once suspicion takes root, it grows fast. They pressed harder, questions turning into accusations. Every detail of her life suddenly reframed as evidence against her. Single mother, angry, stressed, maybe unstable. Financial troubles, maybe she snapped. Connection to the victim? Well, they could spin one if they had to. She wasn't just a neighbor anymore. She was a suspect. The arrest was almost surreal. One moment she was standing in her yard, watching strangers trample the grass, and the next she was in handcuffs, her kids, crying from the window, as strangers pulled their mother away. She tried to shout to them, to promise it was a mistake, but her words were drowned out by the chaos. Her wrists burned from the cuffs, her chest tight with disbelief. The looks from her neighbors cut deeper than the restraints, some shocked, some pitying, some smug in the way people are when gossip confirms their worst assumptions. At the station, things only got worse. The interrogation room was every cliché she'd ever seen on TV: gray walls, metal table, buzzing fluorescent lights. But nothing on TV prepares you for how small it makes you feel. They laid out the towel, photographs of the crime scene, witness statements twisted into something unrecognizable. A neighbor claimed they saw her rushing away from the house. She tried to explain that she'd only stepped outside when she heard shouting, but her words hit the walls and bounced back empty. Carter watched from the other side of the glass. He didn't have to say anything. His silence was its own weapon. The reports he wrote that night would become gospel in the courtroom. His reputation, his badge, his authority, they were stronger than anything she could say. And the cruelest part was that he knew it. He knew all he had to do was point in her direction, and the system would do the rest. By the time the charges were filed, the narrative was set. Maria Jennings, a hard-working mother by day, a violent murderer by night. The media latched on immediately. Brookdale mom arrested in shocking murder. Her photo, pulled from Facebook, plastered on every screen, stripped of context and dignity. Nobody wanted the details, the truth, the gray areas. They wanted a story, and Carter had given them one. Her arraignment felt like theater. The judge read the charges in a monotone voice that made it sound like he'd already decided she was guilty. The prosecutor spoke with rehearsed outrage, painting her as a danger to her own children. Her public defender barely looked up from his notes. Bail was set so high, it may as well have been a denial. Cameras flashed as deputies led her away, and she thought, absurdly, about how she hadn't even finished her tea that night. In her cell, staring at the peeling paint and listening to the hum of fluorescent lights, Maria tried to piece it together. How had her life collapsed in a single evening? How had she gone from folding laundry to being labeled a killer? The answer, though she couldn't prove it yet, was simple. Because the man who should have protected her was the one who betrayed her. Carter had walked out of that house with blood on his hands, and he had decided that hers would be the name carved into the reports instead of his. And that's where the story truly begins, not with the crime itself, but with the betrayal that followed. Because if the people with badges can lie, if they can bend the system to cover their mistakes, then the real question isn't whether Maria can survive the accusation. It's whether anyone can survive a system built to protect its own at the expense of the innocent. Maria Jennings didn't sleep her first night in county jail. Sleep required safety, silence, a certain peace of mind, and none of those existed in a place where the lights never really turned off and every sound carried down the concrete corridors. Like a warning, the cell was small, painted a dull gray that reminded her of the interrogation room, and smelled faintly of bleach mixed with sweat. She lay on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, every nerve in her body wired, every thought looping back to her kids. Had they eaten dinner? Did they cry themselves to sleep? Who was tucking them in now? She replayed the image of their faces at the window, pressed against the glass, wide-eyed with terror as officers pulled her away. It made her chest ache in a way worse than any handcuffs. But no matter how hard she tried to focus on them, her mind kept circling back to one person, Detective James Carter. She couldn't shake the memory of seeing him leave the victim's house, his face pale, his hands clenched. She knew what she saw, but saying it out loud felt like screaming into the void. Who would believe her? A single mom with no resources, no influence, no power, accusing a respected cop of murder and framing her to cover it up. It sounded insane, even to her own ears. The next morning, the routine began. Breakfast was slop on a tray, and she picked at it without appetite. Other inmates sized her up, some curious, some indifferent, some with that look that told her they'd already heard what she was in for. Rumors moved fast in jail, and the mom who killed her neighbor was apparently the headline already. Circulating, she kept her head down. What else could she do? Her public defender, a man named Frank Donnelly, came to see her later that day. He was middle-aged, rumpled suit, coffee breath, a stack of files under one arm. He tried to sound reassuring, but his eyes betrayed the truth. He was overloaded, juggling too many cases, and hers was just one more on the pile. Maria, he said, flipping through papers, we'll push for discovery, see what the states got. Right now, it looks like they've got your towel, a witness statement, and circumstantial motive. It's not the strongest case I've seen, but it's not nothing either. She leaned forward, desperation sharp in her voice. Frank, I didn't do this. I didn't even know the victim. That towel was mine, but it was in my trash. Carter detective. Carter, he was there before anyone. I saw him leaving the house. Donnelly frowned, scribbling something half-heartedly on his pad. You're saying the lead detective is your suspect? She nodded quickly. Yes, he was there. He planted it. I know he did. Donnelly sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Maria, listen to me. Accusing a cop of evidence tampering, let alone murder, without proof. That's a fast track to making the jury hate you. They'll think you're desperate, making things up. We need to work with what we can prove, not what you think you saw. She felt her stomach drop. He didn't believe her. Or worse, he believed her but knew the system wouldn't. When she was escorted back to her cell, Maria realized the cruelest part of her situation wasn't the confinement, it was the helplessness. The truth was a weight in her chest that no one wanted to carry with her. She could scream it until her throat bled, but without proof, it was just noise against the machinery grinding her down. Outside those walls, the machinery kept turning. The press feasted on the story. Local outlets ran her mugshot alongside headlines like Brookdale Mom Snaps and Mother of Two Charged in Brutal Killing. Talk radio callers debated whether she was a cold-blooded killer or just a woman. Pushed too far. Social media was worse strangers tearing her apart, speculating about her personal life, digging through old photos of her kids, questioning her parenting. She was no longer a person. She was content. Fuel for the endless churn. Carter, meanwhile, kept himself busy polishing the narrative. In his report, he framed her as unstable, noting frequent arguments with neighbors and history of stress-related incidents that didn't exist. He found text messages on her phone that sounded incriminating, though Maria knew she never sent anything of the sort. The system took his word as fact, because that's what systems do when a man with a badge hands them paperwork. Every box was checked, every form filed. To challenge it was to challenge the institution itself, and who was going to do that for? A single mom with no money and no allies? As weeks dragged into a month, Maria's world shrank to the size of her cell and the echoes of voices down the corridor. Letters from her kids arrived sporadically, written in shaky handwriting, supervised by social workers. We miss you, Mommy. When are you coming home? She cried over each one, careful to fold them neatly and tuck them under her pillow. As if the words themselves could keep her alive. Then came the preliminary hearing. Shackled at the wrists and ankles, she was led into court, the air thick with the scent of disinfectant and cheap cologne. The prosecutor laid out the case with confidence, hammering on the towel, the witness, the supposed text messages. Donnelly made his objections, weak and perfunctory, but it was clear who the courtroom believed. The judge ruled the state had enough to proceed to trial. Maria was led back out, her chains clinking with every step, her children's faces haunting. Her imagination. That night, back in her cell, something inside her shifted. The system wasn't going to save her. Her lawyer wasn't going to save her. If she wanted the truth to come out, she would have to claw it into the light herself. She didn't know how yet, but the seed was planted. Meanwhile, Carter drank whiskey. Alone in his kitchen, staring at his reflection in the darkened window, he told himself he'd done what he had to do. He told himself no one would believe her. He told himself it would blow over, just another case in the system. But beneath all those assurances, there was a sliver of unease. Maria's eyes haunted him. The way she looked at the one-way glass during interrogation, as if she could see right through it, as if she knew. He shook the thought away, poured another drink, and convinced himself he was safe. He didn't know that sometimes the people you least expect are the ones who fight hardest. Maria was cornered, caged, broken down to nothing, but nothing left to lose can be the most dangerous kind of strength. Maria Jennings had begun to mark time not by days or weeks, but by the small humiliations that stacked on top of each other like bricks. The strip searches, the shouted orders, the meals that looked like something scraped off a cafeteria floor, the way guards addressed her by her inmate number instead of her name. Each one chipped away at the version of herself she used to know. She wasn't Maria the mother, Maria the neighbor, Maria the volunteer at the food pantry. She was inmate number 37,419, accused murderer, the woman the papers wrote about with smirks in their voices. And the system seemed happy to keep it that way. The worst part was the silence about her children. Letters slowed to a trickle, then stopped altogether. Caseworkers told her through tight smiles that the kids were adjusting with their foster placement. Adjusting. That word broke her in ways the handcuffs never could. She pictured her youngest asking where she was, pictured her oldest starting to forget the sound of her voice. She tried to ask for visitation, but each request came back denied. The prosecutor had painted her as a violent, unstable danger to her own family, and until trial, they said, no contact would be in the children's best interest. That phrase, stamped in bureaucratic ink, cut her off from the only thing that kept her breathing. Her lawyer, Frank Donnelly, drifted in and out like a ghost. When he came, he brought news that felt like recycled ash. Motions denied, discovery delayed, the trial date creeping closer. He kept urging her to consider a plea, not because he thought she was guilty, but because he thought the jury would. Maria, he said once, rubbing his temples, the jury pool here trusts cops. They eat breakfast with them. They go to church with them. If you stand up there and accuse Detective Carter of framing you without concrete proof, they'll crucify you. The best I can do is negotiate something that keeps you out of a life sentence. Her throat tightened. I'm not pleading guilty to something I didn't do. His sigh told her he thought she was being naive. Maybe she was, but it was all she had left. On the outside, the narrative kept growing legs. News outlets dug into our past, twisting every scrap of normal hardship into a story. An overdue credit card bill became financial motive. A neighbor who remembered her yelling at her kids once became evidence of a volatile temper. Even her late husband's car accident was dredged up. Insinuations about whether it was really an accident, whether Maria had some dark streak. No one had noticed before. It didn't matter that none of it was true. What mattered was that the public was entertained, and Carter's story gave them a villain to hiss at from their couches. Inside her cell, Maria began to feel the slow burn of paranoia. Every noise in the corridor sounded like a threat. Every glance from another inmate carried suspicion. And in the rare quiet moments, her mind spun in dangerous circles. She replayed the night of the murder like a broken film reel, trying to see what she'd missed. She remembered Carter leaving the house, his face pale. She remembered the scream. Minutes later, she remembered the towel, her towel suddenly found inside when she knew damn well it hadn't been there. The details looped until she could hardly breathe. If she didn't find a way to prove what she knew, she was going to drown in the weight of it. Her first flicker of hope came from an unexpected place. One afternoon, while being escorted to a meeting with Donnelly, she overheard two officers talking near the elevator. One mentioned that Carter had been real edgy lately, drinking more, snapping at colleagues. The other brushed it off, but Maria tucked it away. If cracks were forming in his armor, maybe they would widen. Maybe someone else would start to notice what she already knew. But waiting for someone else to notice wasn't enough. That night, back in her cell, Maria made a decision. She was going to start documenting everything. She begged paper from the guard, who eventually handed her a few sheets grudgingly. She wrote down every memory of that night in brutal detail: the sound of Carter's car engine, the exact angle of his body when he left the house, the words she thought she might have heard him mutter. She wrote down the timeline as she understood it, where her children had been, what she was wearing, even the color of the tea mug she'd set down on the counter. It seemed obsessive, maybe even pointless, but it gave her something she hadn't had in weeks: a sense of control. Donnelly, of course, dismissed it. "Maria, this isn't evidence. It's your word against his. And right now, his word carries the weight of the badge." She slammed her fist on the table, surprising even herself. "Then we make my word heavier." He shook his head, muttering about impossible cases, but something in her defiance seemed to rattle him. Meanwhile, Carter was busy weaving his own safety net. He met with the prosecutor privately, ensuring the case file framed Maria exactly as he needed. He charmed the press when they asked for quotes, offering vague lines about justice for the victim and letting the process work. But at night, when he was alone, he caught himself staring at the evidence board in his office, at the towel bagged in plastic, at the witness statements he knew were shaky. He pushed the doubts away with bourbon, telling himself over and over that Maria was just collateral damage, that the system needed someone to pay, and she was the perfect candidate. Better her than him. The preliminary motions hearing was the next battlefield. Maria sat in her shackles, listening as the prosecutor argued that the towel and the witness testimony were more than enough to move forward. Donnelly objected, pointing out the inconsistencies, but his voice lacked conviction. The judge barely looked at Maria. He granted the state's motions one by one, like clockwork. Each ruling was another nail in her coffin. By the end, Maria felt like she was suffocating, and then something unexpected happened. As she was being led out of the courtroom, a young woman brushed past in the hallway, dropping a folded piece of paper at her feet. Maria glanced down, heart hammering, and managed to scoop it up before the deputies noticed. Back in her cell, she unfolded it with trembling hands. The note was short, written in rushed handwriting. "I know Carter. I know what he did. Stay strong. You're not alone." Her pulse raced. Who had written it? A clerk? A journalist? Another cop? It could have been a trap, some cruel joke. But it felt real. For the first time since the nightmare began, Maria felt the faintest spark of possibility. Someone else out there knew the truth. Someone else saw Carter for what he was. That night she lay awake on the thin mattress, clutching the note like a lifeline, her mind buzzing with new questions. Who had reached out? Would they come forward? Could they survive the pressure if they did? And most importantly, could she hold herself together long enough for that sliver of truth to grow into? Something that could set her free? The walls of the jail still pressed in. The weight of suspicion still crushed her. But for the first time, Maria didn't feel entirely alone. There was a crack in Carter's perfect lie, and cracks have a way of spreading if you push hard enough. She didn't know how or when, but she knew one thing with certainty. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The day of Maria Jennings's first major court hearing began with the sound of chains. Deputies fastened the cuffs around her wrists, the shackles around her ankles, and guided her down the echoing corridors of the county jail toward the transport van. She had tried to steel herself for it, tried to imagine she could walk into that courtroom with dignity, but the truth was the restraints made her feel less than human. She shuffled along in the too large orange jumpsuit, trying not to trip, her eyes fixed on the floor because she couldn't stand to meet the stares of the other inmates watching her pass. When she stepped into the cold morning air, the sun stung her eyes. It was the first time she'd seen daylight in weeks, and it felt almost cruel. Outside the jail, the van waited with its steel mesh windows. Reporters were already clustered. Near the courthouse across town, cameras primed, ready to devour her humiliation for the evening news. The ride was silent except for the hum of the engine and the clank of the chains when the van hit bumps. Maria tried to breathe evenly, tried to push her panic down, but her heart raced as they neared the courthouse. She knew what awaited her there. A room full of strangers ready to decide whether she was a murderer before they even heard a word from her lips. The prosecution would have their polished narrative. Carter would sit in his suit, the picture of professionalism, his lies wrapped in the credibility of his badge. And she would be the villain of their story, a desperate mother who snapped. She thought of her children again, and the thought nearly crushed her. Would they see her face on the news tonight, her mugshot splashed across the screen, while the anchor spoke about her like she was a monster? Would they start to believe it? The courthouse was colder than she remembered. Marble floors, high ceilings, the smell of polish and paper. Deputies guided her through the metal detectors, down hallways lined with reporters who shouted questions she couldn't answer. "Maria, did you kill him? Do you have anything to say to your children?" Flashes from cameras seared her eyes. She kept her gaze straight ahead, jaw tight, because if she faltered now, if she let them see the tears threatening behind her eyes, they would twist it into something it wasn't. Weakness, guilt, regret. She had none of those, not for herself. She only regretted that her kids were caught in the fallout of Carter's betrayal. When the heavy doors to the courtroom swung open, the noise shifted. Inside was quieter, but not less hostile. Reporters whispered in the gallery. Court clerks shuffled papers. The judge sat on the bench, already peering down at her like she was just another docket number to get through before lunch. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Claire Morton, stood ready, her tailored suit crisp, her binder thick with evidence that Maria knew was half lies and half misinterpretations. Morton was good, everyone said so. Sharp, ambitious, with a reputation for never losing a case. Maria wondered if she saw her as just another notch on her belt. And then there was Carter. He sat near the prosecutor's table, uniform pressed, tie neat, his face carefully neutral. He didn't look at Maria when she was led in, but she could feel his presence like a pressure in the room. To anyone else, he looked like a steady, professional officer assisting justice. To Maria, he looked like the devil hiding behind polished shoes and polished lies. She wanted to scream, to stand up and point at him and tell everyone what she saw that night, but her lawyer had drilled it into her. Sit still, say nothing, let him do the talking. She felt like a prop in her own life, forced to watch while other people argued over the shape of her future. The hearing began with Morton laying out the state's case. Her voice was calm, confident, rehearsed. Your Honor, the defendant, Maria Jennings, was seen near the victim's home shortly before the murder. A bloody towel belonging to her was recovered inside the crime scene. Witnesses attest to her erratic behavior. Furthermore, text messages from her phone suggest a strained relationship with the victim. Taken together, this evidence points clearly to her guilt. She spoke as if it were already settled fact, as if Maria's innocence was never even on the table. Each word was a knife. Maria wanted to shout that the texts were fake, that the towel was planted, that she had no relationship with the victim at all. But she stayed silent, her hands clenched in her lap, nails digging into her skin hard enough to leave crescents. Then Donnelly rose. Her lawyer's suit was wrinkled, his notes disorganized. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began. Your Honor, the defense maintains that Ms. Jennings has been wrongfully accused. The evidence against her is circumstantial at best. The witness accounts are inconsistent, and the alleged text messages are dubious. We will show at trial that Detective Carter's investigation was flawed and rushed, leading to a false conclusion. Maria's chest tightened at the words flawed investigation. It was the closest Donnelly had come to hinting at the truth, but his tone lacked fire. He sounded tired, unconvinced even of himself. The judge barely looked up from his notes. Morton pounced, objecting to nearly every sentence Donnelly tried to utter. She painted him as reaching, as throwing smoke to distract from the overwhelming evidence. And the judge, more often than not, sustained her objections. Maria sat through it all like she was underwater, words echoing and distorted, the weight of inevitability pressing down on her. She wasn't winning this battle. She wasn't even allowed to fight it. The climax of the hearing came when Morton called Carter to the stand. Maria's pulse spiked as he walked calmly to the witness box, swore his oath, and took his seat. He spoke smoothly, every answer practiced. He described finding the towel, described Maria's supposed odd behavior, described how the timeline matched her presence near the house. His lies were seamless, wrapped in the authority of his badge. When Donnelly cross-examined, he was hesitant, almost deferential. Detective Carter, isn't it true that you arrived on scene before other officers? Carter nodded. Yes, I was nearby. I responded quickly. And you didn't see Ms. Jennings until later? That's correct. Donnelly tried again. Could there have been another explanation for the towel's presence? Morton objected. The judge sustained. Cross-examination was over almost as soon as it began. Maria's one chance to see Carter cornered evaporated, like Miss Dot by the end. The judge ruled that the case had sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. Maria's heart sank. She had known it was coming, but hearing the words felt like a death. Sentence delivered without ceremony. Deputies led her back out, cameras flashing once again as she passed through the hall. She kept her chin up, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. But inside, she felt hollow. Back in her cell that night, she unfolded the note she had been hiding, the one that said, I know Carter. I know what he did. She traced the handwriting with her finger, wondering who had slipped it to her. Whoever it was, they were her only lifeline. If someone out there knew the truth, maybe she had a chance. But the note gave her no name, no number, no way to reach back. It was a whisper in the dark, fragile and fleeting. She needed more. She began to strategize in her head. If she couldn't rely on Donnelly, she would have to find another way. Maybe the press. Maybe someone inside the department who had doubts. Maybe the person who wrote the note would surface again. She didn't know. But she knew this. Carter had built his story on lies, and lies have a way of unraveling. All it took was one loose thread. She just had to survive long enough to find. Meanwhile, in his own home, Carter sat at his kitchen table, staring at a glass of bourbon, but not in his stomach tighter than ever. He told himself he was safe, that the case was airtight, that Maria was trapped. But he couldn't shake the memory of her eyes in the courtroom, locked on him with an intensity that burned. She wasn't broken yet. And if she wasn't broken, she could still be dangerous. Maria Jennings learned quickly that in jail, hope was both a weapon and a liability. The folded note she kept hidden under her mattress was the only proof she had that someone out there believed her, that someone else knew the truth about Carter. But even that paper burned in her hands. She couldn't show it to Donnelly, her weary public defender, because he would dismiss it as hearsay. She couldn't mention it to guards or other inmates, because whispers had a way of spreading and disappearing before they reached anyone useful. For now, the note was hers alone, a tiny flame she protected with everything she had left. But protecting it didn't solve the problem she needed more. Every night, lying awake on the thin mattress with the echo of slamming doors rattling her nerves, she tried to imagine who had slipped it to her. A clerk? A reporter? Another cop with a conscience? And why hadn't they come forward yet? What were they afraid of, or who? The trial loomed closer each day, and the prosecution wasted no time feeding the press. Articles described her as volatile, secretive, a mother with a hidden side. They dug up the time she missed a PTA meeting because she was sick, twisting it into patterns of neglect. They interviewed neighbors who speculated she must have snapped under the stress of single parenthood. The narrative was tightening around her neck like a rope. In her cell, Maria replayed every detail she could remember, desperately searching for cracks in Carter's version of events. She wrote everything down again and again, filling scrap after scrap of paper. The time she put the kids to bed, sound of Carter's car leaving, the scream that followed. She knew these details by heart, but if she let herself forget even one, she was afraid the truth would vanish with it. And then something changed. One afternoon, Donnelly came to see her, his usual sluggishness replaced by something sharper. He carried a folder under his arm and dropped into the chair across from her. "You're not going to believe this," he muttered. He opened the folder and slid a photo across the table. It was grainy, printed from a surveillance camera, but unmistakable. Carter's car, parked 2 blocks from the victim's house at N. The exact time Maria swore she saw him leaving. Maria's breath caught. "Where did you get this?" Donnelly hesitated, glancing toward the one-way mirror on the wall, then back at her. "Anonymous tip. Came to my office yesterday. No return address. Just this photo and a note saying, 'Look closer at Carter.'" Maria's hands trembled as she held the photo. It was proof, not everything, not enough to clear her on its own, but proof that she wasn't imagining things, proof that someone else was trying to help. But Donnelly, ever cautious, shook his head. "This isn't a smoking gun. A defense attorney waves this around in court. The prosecution says it's circumstantial. No timestamp, no chain of custody, no guarantee. It even came from where it says it did." But he leaned closer, lowering his voice. "It rattles me. If someone out there is leaking this, it means Carter isn't as untouchable as he thinks. And if he's nervous enough to get sloppy, we might find more." Maria clutched the photo, her hope sharpening into anger. "Then we find more. I don't care how." Donnelly grimaced. "You don't get it, Maria. Going after a cop like Carter isn't just about the evidence. It's about the system. Everyone in this courthouse, judges, jurors, even me, we've worked with him. He's one of us. To take him down, we need more than proof. We need something undeniable, something that forces their hand." That night, Maria lay awake with the photo under her pillow, the image burned into her mind. For weeks, she had felt like she was drowning, but now she could feel the faintest sensation of her head breaking the surface. Someone was helping her. Someone wanted Carter exposed, but who? And why were they risking it now? She didn't know, but she knew she couldn't waste it. Meanwhile, Carter himself was unraveling. He spent long nights in his office, staring at case files, pouring bourbon into his coffee mug to quiet the gnawing fear in his gut. The Jennings case was supposed to be clean, wrapped up tight, but small things started slipping. A rookie officer had asked too many questions about the chain of custody on the towel. A journalist kept calling the precinct, asking about inconsistencies in the timeline. Carter snapped at them, shut down the questions, but every time he saw Maria in the courtroom, her eyes locked on him with that cold certainty. It chipped away at his confidence. She wasn't broken. And if she wasn't broken, she was dangerous. The next hearing brought the tension into sharper focus. Maria sat shackled at the defense table as Morton, the prosecutor, announced new evidence. A partial fingerprint on the towel, consistent with Maria's. She felt her stomach drop. She knew she'd touched that towel when she threw it away. But the implication was obvious. Morton made it sound like proof, her voice dripping with triumph. Donnelly objected, pointing out the possibility of contamination, but the judge overruled him. Maria glanced toward Carter. For the first time, she thought she saw a flicker in his eyes, the smallest twitch in his jaw. He was nervous. He knew how fragile his house of cards really was. Later that night, back in her cell, Maria pulled out her hidden note again. The words echoed in her head. I know Carter. I know what he did. Combined with the photo, it meant someone out there was fighting alongside her, even if she couldn't see them. And she realized something else. Carter wasn't invincible. He was human, flawed, scared. If she pushed hard enough, if she found the right cracks, she could make the truth bleed out into the open. But pushing hard came with risks. Rumors began to circulate in the jail. Inmates whispered that Maria wasn't just some random mom accused of murder. She was up against a cop. That fact made her both a curiosity and a target. Some respected her for it. Others saw her as trouble. One night, a woman in the cell across from hers leaned close to the bars and whispered, "You better be careful. People who go after cops don't last long." Maria lay awake after that, staring into the dark, her pulse racing. She knew it wasn't paranoia anymore. If Carter thought she was a threat, he wouldn't stop at lies in a courtroom. He would destroy her completely. Still, she clung to the scraps of evidence like lifelines. She memorized every detail of the photo, every stroke of handwriting on the anonymous note. And with each passing day, her resolve hardened. She had been passive too long, waiting for Donnelly, waiting for the system. If she wanted to survive, if she wanted to see her children again, she had to become more than the victim Carter tried to make her. She had to fight back. Meanwhile, Carter met with Morton late one night in her office. The blinds were drawn, the room dimly lit. "Sure you've got her locked down?" he asked, his voice tight. Morton gave him a sharp look. "The evidence is strong. The jury will eat it up. But James, if there's anything I should know anything at all, you need to tell me now." Carter forced a smile, but sweat pricked his temples. "She's desperate. She'll say anything to save herself. Don't let her rattle you." Morton didn't press, but as Carter left her office, he could feel it, the walls closing in. And so the stage was set. Maria with scraps of hope hidden under her mattress. Carter with fear eating away at his confidence. The prosecution tightening its grip, the defense flailing to keep up. Both sides knew the trial would be the crucible, the moment where truth and lies collided. And Maria understood, more clearly than ever, that the truth alone wouldn't save her. She would have to drag it into the light, piece by piece, even if it cost her everything. Maria Jennings had thought the worst of her nightmare was already behind her, but the weeks leading up to trial taught her otherwise. The pressure tightened daily, not just from the weight of her confinement, but from the invisible web of Carter's. Reach. Inmates whispered her name in the halls. Guards lingered near her cell longer than necessary, and every so often she would feel eyes on her that weren't supposed to be there. Whether it was paranoia or reality, she couldn't tell anymore, but the effect was the same. She never felt safe. The anonymous note and the grainy photo of Carter's car had given her the first flicker of hope she'd felt in months. But hope came with its own burden. If there really was someone out there who knew the truth, it meant Carter had more enemies than just her. And it meant those people might be in danger too. She wasn't just fighting for her life anymore. She was caught in a storm that could pull others down with her. Her lawyer, Donnelly, shuffled into their next meeting looking even more haggard than usual. He dropped into the chair across from her with a sigh, setting down a stack of papers. Discovery came in, he muttered. "You're not going to like it." Maria braced herself as he spread out the documents. More fingerprints. More digital evidence that supposedly tied her to the victim. Call logs she'd never seen before, showing late-night conversations she swore never happened. Donnelly rubbed his temples. "They're stacking the deck. Every piece of this has Carter's fingerprints all over it. Not literally, but you know what I mean. He's feeding them everything, and the prosecution is eating it up." Maria's chest tightened. "You don't believe this, do you?" Donnelly gave her a weary look. "Believing you and proving it in court are two different things. Right now, we've got scraps. A photo with no chain of custody, a note with no signature, and your testimony against a decorated cop. It's not enough." Maria clenched her fists. "Then we make it enough. You keep telling me the system won't listen unless I have proof. Fine. Then we find proof. If Carter can fake evidence, he can slip up. He has to." Donnelly looked at her like she was a child, insisting the tooth fairy was real, but he didn't argue further. The truth was, Carter was slipping. Nights found him alone in his office, bourbon staining the corners of case files, his reflection in the dark window a reminder of what he'd buried. He told himself Maria would fold under the pressure, that she would take a plea deal, but she hadn't. Every time he saw her in the courtroom, her eyes bored into him, unbroken, unflinching, and it gnawed at him. He started snapping at younger officers, warning them off from asking questions. He avoided journalists who called about inconsistencies in the timeline. And in his most private moments, he cursed himself for not walking away that night when he had the chance. Back in the jail, Maria's world took another dangerous turn. One evening, as she returned from the visitation room, an inmate cornered her in the hallway. The woman was bigger, hardened by years inside, her voice low and menacing. "Word is you're trying to bring down a cop," she hissed. "That's a bad move in here. People who cross the blue line don't last long." Maria's guard shoved the woman away before anything escalated, but the message lingered. It wasn't just the outside world that Carter controlled. His shadow stretched into the jail, too. If he wanted her silenced before trial, there were plenty of ways to make it happen. That night, Maria hardly slept. Every rustle, every distant clang of metal, every cough from another cell felt like a threat. But even through the fear, her resolve hardened. If Carter wanted her afraid, it meant he knew she was dangerous. The turning point came when Donnelly received another anonymous envelope. Inside was a USB drive and a short note. Check the timestamps. Carter was there first. Donnelly plugged it into his office computer and found raw surveillance footage from a gas station near the crime scene. The video was grainy, but it clearly showed Carter's car pulling in just minutes before the murder call was placed. The timestamp was intact, verifiable. It wasn't definitive proof of guilt, but it was damning. Donnelly brought it to Maria the next day, his hands shaking. This changes things. Whoever's feeding us this, they're close to Carter. Too close. And if this gets out, it won't just rattle him, it'll shake the whole department. Maria leaned forward, gripping the table. Then we use it. Please, Frank, don't let them bury this. But Donnelly wasn't so sure. If we present this, they'll demand to know where it came from. If I can't prove the chain of custody, they'll argue it's been tampered with. But if we hold it back and wait for trial, it could blindside them. The question is, can we survive until then? Maria swallowed hard. She knew what he meant. The closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. Carter had already proven he was willing to frame her to save himself. What else was he willing to do? Carter, meanwhile, was unraveling faster. He'd heard whispers in the precinct questions about his involvement, about why he was first on scene. He barked at colleagues, threatened anyone who pried too deep. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Late at night, he sat in his car outside Maria's house, now empty, dark, the lawn overgrown. He stared at the windows, remembering the night he slipped her towel into the victim's home, the way his hands shook as he shoved it under the couch. He told himself it had been necessary, that she was disposable, that the badge gave him cover. But the silence of the house mocked him. He wasn't covering his mistake anymore. He was building his own Neustadt back in her cell. Maria began to feel the shift. Guards spoke differently around her, some with disdain, others with pity. A few seemed almost nervous. Word was spreading that Carter wasn't untouchable after all. That night, Maria pulled out both notes she'd hidden the first, scribbled in haste, and the second, typed and precise. Together with the photo and the footage, they formed a fragile mosaic of truth. Still incomplete, still breakable, but enough to remind her she wasn't fighting alone. She traced the words again. "You're not alone." For the first time, she believed it, but belief didn't erase the danger. A week later, Donnelly was followed home from court by an unmarked car. He noticed it in his mirror, tailing him through 3 turns before it peeled away. He told Maria about it the next day, trying to downplay it, but the unease in his voice gave him away. Carter was tightening the screws. If he couldn't silence Maria, maybe he could scare off her lawyer. Maria leaned across the table, her voice low and fierce. "Frank, you can walk away if you want, but I can't. This is my life. My kids' lives. I need you." For once, Donnelly didn't lecture her about reality or caution. He just nodded, a flicker of resolve in his tired eyes. The trial date was set. Maria lay awake the night before, the walls pressing in, her heart pounding. She knew what awaited her. A courtroom full of strangers, a prosecutor hungry for a win, a cop desperate to bury his sins. But she also knew something else. For the first time since this nightmare began, she wasn't walking in with nothing. She had proof. Fragile, imperfect proof, but proof all the same. And she was ready to fight. Across town, Carter sat in his living room, the bottle empty beside him, his hands trembling. He told himself he had control, that he could spin this, that he'd survived worse. But deep down, he knew it. The walls were closing in. Maria Jennings was supposed to be his scapegoat. Instead, she had become his reckoning. The trial of Maria Jennings began not with a bang, but with the dull scrape of chairs and the shuffle of papers, the kind of ordinary noises that somehow carried the weight of life and death. The courthouse was packed reporters, curious neighbors, court staff, all hungry to see whether the woman they had read about in the papers would break or fight. Maria sat at the defense table, wrists uncuffed at last, but the phantom ache of the shackles still lingering. She tried to steady her breathing, to remind herself that every camera lens pointed her way was waiting for the smallest sign of weakness. Across the aisle, Prosecutor Claire Morton was composed, confident, her navy suit pressed, her binder stacked with neatly labeled tabs. And sitting just a few feet from her, Detective James Carter looked every bit the decorated officer he was. Supposed to be polished shoes, straight tie, the stoic face of authority. He didn't look at Maria, but she could feel him anyway, the way a shadow presses against your back when you know you're not alone. The jury was sworn in. 12 strangers who would hold Maria's future in their hands. As they settled into the box, Maria searched their faces for any flicker of sympathy, any sign that they might see past the prosecution's story. But most were blank, cautious, already guarded against bias. Donnelly, her weary public defender, leaned close and whispered, "Don't react to anything, no matter how bad it sounds. Jurors notice everything. Keep your face neutral." Maria nodded, though inside she was boiling. Neutral, as if neutrality could save her when Carter had stacked the deck with lies. Morton's opening statement was polished to perfection. She painted Maria as a mother under pressure, simmering with hidden rage until it spilled over into violence. She spoke of the towel found at the scene, of the witness who placed Maria near the house, of the volatile personality suggested by carefully cherry-picked anecdotes. She glanced at the jury with just the right mix of sternness and pity, as if inviting them to share in the tragedy of a good man's life, stolen by a woman who simply lost control. Maria's stomach twisted as she listened. Every word was designed to slice away her humanity, to make her a caricature of guilt. When Donnelly rose for the defense, the contrast was glaring. His suit was wrinkled, his voice rasped with fatigue, and his notes looked hastily assembled. But he tried. He told the jury that Maria was a loving mother, a hard worker, a woman with no history of violence. He emphasized the lack of direct evidence, no DNA tying her to the crime, no eyewitness who saw her commit it. And then, almost casually, he hinted at what would come. You'll hear testimony, and you'll see evidence that will raise serious questions about the investigation itself. Questions about whether everything was done by the book. Questions about whether the real story has been buried. His voice wavered as he said it, but Maria clung to those words. For the first time, her truth was at least whispered into the room. The first days of testimony were brutal. Neighbors testified about hearing Maria's raised voice once, about seeing her upset in the weeks before the murder. None of it mattered. None of it proved anything. But Morton wove it together like a tapestry of guilt. Then came the forensic tech who described the towel in detail, the bloodstains, the partial fingerprint consistent with Maria's. Maria wanted to scream that of course her print was on it. It was her towel, thrown in her own trash. But the jury nodded along, and she could see the doubt in their eyes turning solid. Every glance in her direction felt like judgment, like a verdict already forming. Then Carter took the stand. Maria's pulse pounded in her ears as he raised his hand and swore the oath. He spoke with the ease of a man used to being believed. He described arriving at the scene, finding the towel, observing Maria's strange behavior. He described her as evasive, inconsistent, angry. His lies flowed smoothly, practiced lines honed over weeks of preparation. Morton guided him gently, giving him every opportunity to frame the story his way. And the jury listened, attentive, respectful, some even leaning forward as if they were listening to a trusted teacher. Maria clenched her fists under the table, her nails digging into her palms. Every word he spoke was a brick in the wall closing around her. When Donnelly cross-examined, it was like watching a man chip at stone with a spoon. He asked about the timeline, about Carter's arrival before other officers, about possible contamination of evidence. Carter brushed it all aside with polished answers. I responded quickly. No, the scene was secure. Yes, procedure was followed. Each answer was a door slammed shut. Donnelly pressed harder, his voice shaking with frustration, but Morton objected at every turn, and the judge sustained more often than not. By the time Donnelly sat down, Maria felt hollow. The truth was in the room, but no one wanted to hear it, and yet cracks began to show. During a recess, Maria caught Carter. Watching her, his jaw tight, his eyes narrowed. It wasn't the look of a confident man. It was the look of someone rattled, someone who knew his story was fragile if pushed hard enough. And then On the third day of trial, the anonymous lifeline returned. As Maria was led back to her holding cell, a guard slipped a folded note into her shackled hands. She hid it quickly, her heart racing. Back in her cell, she unfolded it to see only 6 words. "He knows you saw him there." Her blood ran cold. Whoever was sending these notes wasn't just sympathetic, they had insight. Maybe even direct knowledge of Carter's thoughts. The risk they were taking was enormous. But the message was clear. Carter was worried about her. He knew she hadn't broken. He knew she still held the power to destroy him if the right thread unraveled. That night, Maria couldn't sleep. She stared at the note, at the photo, at the USB footage Donnelly had hidden away, as she pieced it all together. Carter wasn't invincible. He was desperate. And desperate men made mistakes. The challenge now was forcing him to make one in front of the jury. The next morning, Donnelly looked warm but determined. "I've been holding something back," he told her quietly. He slid a copy of the gas station footage across the table. "We'll use it when the time's right. If Morton thinks she's got this case locked up, dropping this will hit harder. But it's risky. They'll hammer us on where it came from, on whether it's been altered. The judge might even throw it out. But if it rattles Carter, even for a second, it might open the door." Maria nodded, her pulse racing. "Do it, whatever it takes." When the defense's turn came, Donnelly finally presented the footage. The grainy video filled the courtroom screens, showing Carter's car pulling into the gas station at a time that contradicted his testimony. The jury leaned in, murmurs rippling through the gallery. Morton objected furiously, demanding to know the source, claiming it was unreliable. The judge allowed it provisionally, but warned the jury about unverified evidence. Still, Maria saw it, the flicker in Carter's eyes, the tightening of his jaw, the bead of sweat at his temple. For the first time, the mask slipped. Moment was fleeting, quickly drowned by Morton's objections and the judge's cautions, but Maria clung to it like a lifeline. The jury had seen Carter rattled. They had seen that his story wasn't airtight, and now the seed of doubt was planted. Back in her cell that night, Maria sat on her cot, the noise of the jail fading around her. She held the latest note, the words echoing in her mind. "He knows you saw him there." The sender was right. Carter knew, and he was terrified of it. That terror was her weapon now. The question was how to sharpen it enough to cut through the wall of lies before the gavel fell across town. Carter sat in his darkened living room, the trial transcripts spread across his table, the bourbon glass empty beside him. He replayed the gas station footage over and over in his head, cursing whoever had leaked it. His reflection in the window looked back at him with hollow eyes. He had built a tower of lies, but the foundation was starting to crack. And as much as he wanted to believe he could control it, he knew deep down that Maria Jennings wasn't done fighting. She was coming for him, and the only question left was whether he would break before she did. By the second week of trial, the atmosphere inside the courtroom felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a slow-motion war. Every glance, every objection, every carefully chosen word carried the weight of lives and reputations. For Maria Jennings, the days blurred together into a haze of testimonies, whispered conferences with Donnelly, and the constant awareness of Carter's presence just a few feet away. He never looked at her directly, but she could feel him, a quiet storm of menace wrapped in the illusion of authority. The jurors still sat with their guarded expressions, but Maria had begun to notice something subtle, the slightest shifts in posture, the faintest flickers of unease whenever Carter spoke. The gas station footage had done its job, not enough. To free her, not yet, but enough to shake the perfect narrative he had built. She could see it in their eyes, doubt, small, fragile, but growing. Morton, the prosecutor, sensed it too. Her questions became sharper, her objections more aggressive, as if trying to plug holes in a dam she didn't want to admit was cracking. She doubled down on the towel, on the fingerprint, on the witness who claimed to see Maria near the victim's house. But for every confident assertion she made, Donnelly chipped back with quiet persistence. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't brilliant, but Maria realized that his weariness carried a strange advantage. The jury didn't see him as slick or manipulative. He looked like a man simply doing his best to represent someone society had already discarded. That honesty, however tired, was starting to land. Still, the prosecution had one weapon left: Maria's children. Morton announced that she would call a social worker to testify about the children's placement and the emotional trauma they suffered. Maria's heart clenched as the woman took the stand, describing in clinical tones how the children cried for their mother, how they struggled in foster care, how they asked if she was ever coming home. Morton's voice softened as she framed the children as the true victims of Miss Jennings's violent act. Maria's hands shook under the table. She wanted to scream, to shout that she loved her children more than anything, that she would never harm them, that Carter had stolen not only her freedom but their innocence. Instead, she sat silent, her jaw clenched, because any outburst would be painted as instability. The jurors avoided her eyes, as if looking at her pain too closely might force them to feel it. That night, Maria sat on the cot in her cell, the weight of it crushing her. She pulled out the notes she had hidden, the first, the second, the third. The anonymous ally's voice echoed in her head, "You're not alone." But she had never felt lonelier. For hours she stared at the concrete wall, trying to summon the strength to keep going. She thought of her children, their letters, their smiles. She thought of Carter, sitting somewhere smug and confident, counting on her to break. And in that darkness, something hardened inside her. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. She would endure, even if it killed her. The next day brought the defense's turn, and with it, a surprise. Donnelly called a witness Maria hadn't expected. Young officer from the precinct, clearly nervous, hands shaking as he took the stand. His name was Officer Daniels, barely out of academy, and Maria could see Carter stiffen as the boy swore his oath. Donnelly's questions were simple at first, about procedure, about who secured the scene. Then came the shift. "Officer Daniels," Donnelly asked, "isn't it true that Detective Carter arrived before you and other officers?" Daniels hesitated, glancing toward Carter. "Yes, sir. He was already inside when I got there." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Donnelly pressed on. "And when you entered, did you see him handling any items?" Daniels swallowed hard. I saw him near the couch. He had something in his hand, but I can't say what." Morton shot to her feet with an objection, but the seed had been planted. The jury had heard it. Someone else had seen Carter near the very spot where the towel was later found. Morton tried to spin it on redirect, painting Daniels as inexperienced, uncertain, easily mistaken. But Maria caught the glance Carter threw the young officer, a flash of pure threat disguised as calm professionalism. Daniels shrank under it, but the damage was done. Another crack in Carter's story, another thread pulled loose. That evening, Maria's anonymous ally struck again. A new note waited in her cell after dinner, slipped under her mattress when she wasn't looking. This one was longer, typed on plain paper. "Daniels is scared." Carter pressured others to back his story, but not everyone is loyal. He planted more than just the towel. "Look for inconsistencies in the evidence logs. The dates don't line up." Maria read it over and over, her pulse racing. Inconsistencies in the logs. That was something tangible, something Donnelly could actually present in court. She handed it to him the next morning, her voice urgent. Donnelly looked at her like she'd handed him a live grenade. "Where the hell are you getting these?" She shook her head. I don't know, but they're right, Frank. You saw Carter slip. We can prove it. Donnelly hesitated, but for the first time, Maria saw something new in his eyes. Belief. Over the next few days, Donnelly dug into the evidence logs. He spent hours combing through discovery, matching dates and signatures, looking for what the note had promised. And then he found it. The towel's entry into evidence had a timestamp earlier. Then Carter officially reported arriving at the scene. It was small, easily dismissed as a clerical error, but when stacked against the footage, the photo, Daniels's testimony, it formed a pattern. A pattern that suggested Carter wasn't just sloppy. He was lying. When Donnelly presented this in court, Morton fought back viciously, arguing that errors happen, that it didn't negate the evidence itself. But the jury leaned forward, listening closely. And Maria, watching Carter from across the room, saw the sweat bead at his temple again. The cracks were widening. That night, Maria lay awake, the hum of the jail fading into the background. She thought of her children, of the jurors, of the faceless ally who kept feeding her hope. She thought of Carter unraveling under the weight of his own lies. And for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine it. Freedom, walking out of those steel doors, holding her children again, hearing the word, not guilty, and knowing that the truth had finally clawed its way into the light. Across town, Carter sat in his darkened office, the glow of the computer screen casting harsh shadows on his face. He stared at the evidence, logs, at the inconsistencies he had brushed off, at the holes he thought he had buried. His hands shook as he poured another drink. He had thought Maria Jennings would fold, that she would crumble under the system's weight. Instead, she was still standing, still fighting, and now others were starting to stand with her. The walls were closing in, and he could feel it. He told himself he could outlast her, outmaneuver her, bury her beneath his badge. But in the silence of the empty office, with the bourbon burning his throat and the lies burning his conscience, he felt the truth he could never admit out loud. Maria wasn't the one on trial anymore. He was. The trial was no longer about Maria Jennings alone. By the time the 9th day of proceedings began, the air in the courtroom was charged with something different: curiosity, unease, a sense that the story the prosecution had tried to write was starting to unravel. The jurors felt it. The reporters scribbling furiously felt it. Even the judge, though careful to remain neutral, seemed sharper in tone when addressing Morton's objections. And Maria, sitting at the defense table, felt it most of all. The lies that had crushed her for months were finally being exposed, one thread at a time. But every revelation carried its own danger. For every witness who hesitated under questioning, for every inconsistency in the logs, Maria knew Carter was tightening his grip somewhere else, plotting the next move to protect himself. That morning, Donnelly rose and called an unexpected witness. A records clerk from the precinct, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a nervous posture. She testified about the process of logging evidence, the signatures required, the digital timestamps. Donnelly guided her carefully until he asked the question that mattered. Is it possible for evidence to be logged before it was officially collected? The woman hesitated, glancing at Morton before answering. No, the system doesn't. Allow it. The timestamp is automatic. Donnelly leaned in. So how do you explain this? He handed her the towel's evidence log, showing the entry time earlier than Carter's official arrival. The courtroom went silent. The clerk shifted uncomfortably. That shouldn't be possible, she admitted. Murmurs spread through the gallery. Morton objected, claiming it was clerical error, but the damage was done. The jury had heard it. The system itself contradicted Carter's story. Maria felt her pulse racing. It was small, just a crack, but it was real. For the first time, she allowed herself to meet the jurors' eyes, silently begging them to see her not as the villain Morton painted, but as the victim of something larger, something darker. She could see it, some of them were starting to doubt. Not all, not enough, but some. Carter, seated stiffly near the prosecution's table, barely moved during the exchange, but Maria caught it again, the twitch in his jaw, the tightness around his eyes. He was rattled, and when Carter was rattled, he made mistakes. The next blow came from Donnelly's decision to recall Officer Daniels. Morton protested, but the judge allowed it. Daniels looked even more nervous than before as he took the stand. Again, glancing frequently at Carter. Donnelly's voice was calm, deliberate. "Officer, when you first arrived at the scene, you testified that Detective Carter was already inside. Did he give you instructions?" Daniels swallowed hard. "Yes. He told me to secure the perimeter and not to touch anything inside." "Did you see him place anything near the couch?" Daniels hesitated, then shook his head. "No, sir, I can't say that." Donnelly pressed. "But you saw him near the couch?" Daniels nodded reluctantly. Morton objected again, but the jury had already seen the hesitation, the fear in the young officer's eyes. Maria wanted to leap out of her chair and scream, "He's lying." He planted the towel right there, but she stayed silent, her nails biting into her palms. The jury didn't need her outburst. They needed to see Carter sweat, and they were seeing it. During the lunch recess, Donnelly leaned toward her. "We've got momentum, but it's fragile. One wrong move and they'll dismiss it all as coincidence. We need something undeniable." Maria thought of the anonymous notes, of the unseen ally feeding them information. "There's more," she whispered. "I know it. They haven't stopped yet. They'll give us something big." Donnelly looked doubtful, but didn't argue. That night, her cell was silent, except for the distant echoes of other inmates. Maria lay awake, staring at the ceiling, clutching the folded notes she kept hidden under her mattress. She had begun to imagine the faceless ally as a guardian angel, but she knew the truth. Whoever it was, they were taking enormous risks. If Carter found them, they would pay the price. The thought twisted her stomach, but she couldn't stop clinging to the hope that they weren't finished. The next morning, her hope was answered. Donnelly arrived with an envelope, his expression unreadable. He set it on the table between them. "This came to my office last night." Maria's hands shook as she opened it. Inside were photocopied pages, Carter's original incident report, and a later version filed days afterward. Side by side, the differences were glaring. In the first, Carter had noted arriving after other officers. In the second, rewritten version, he placed himself first on the scene. Maria's chest tightened. It was proof, solid, black and white proof that he had changed his story. Donnelly looked at her, his voice low. "This is perjury. If we can get this admitted, it's a bombshell." Maria could barely breathe. "Then use it. Please, Frank, this is the thread. Pull it." When Donnelly presented the conflicting reports in court, Morton fought like a cornered animal. She argued about drafts, about clerical corrections, about misunderstandings. But the jury saw it. 2 different stories, 1 officer, 1 night. Carter's credibility was bleeding out in real time. Donnelly pushed harder, his voice rising for the first time. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a mistake. This is not a typo. This is a man with a badge rewriting reality to cover himself. And if he's willing to lie about this, what else has he lied about?" The words echoed through the courtroom. Morton objected, shouting, but the jury was staring at Carter now, their doubt no longer subtle. Carter's composure cracked. Under Morton's redirect, his answers grew shorter, sharper, his calm veneer slipping. When asked about the conflicting reports, he stumbled. It was an early draft. I corrected it later. But the damage was done. Jurors exchanged glances. The gallery buzzed. And Maria for the first time, felt a surge of something. Stronger than hope. Vindication. That night, Maria sat in her cell, her heart pounding, unable to sleep. The trial wasn't over. Morton still had weapons left, and Carter wasn't finished fighting. But the tide had shifted. The narrative was no longer hers alone to carry. The jury had seen the cracks, the lies, the inconsistencies. The truth was clawing its way out, and Carter could no longer bury it under polished shoes and polished words. Across town, Carter sat alone in his car, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. He replayed the day in his head, the jurors' eyes on him, the photocopied reports flashing across the courtroom screens. He told himself he could still spin it, still control it. But deep down, he knew what Maria had realized too. The trial wasn't about her anymore. It was about him. And the walls were closing in. The final days of Maria Jennings's trial carried the kind of tension that makes people lean forward in their seats without realizing it, the kind that quiets even the most restless courtroom into breathless silence. The story that had begun as a neat, clean prosecution, the story of a mother who snapped, was no longer neat or clean. It was frayed, torn, the edges blackened by inconsistencies and lies. And those lies had one name at the center of them: Detective James Carter. Maria knew it. Donnelly knew it. Even Morton, though she would never admit it, had begun to feel the weight of it. And the jury, those 12 strangers who held Maria's fate in their hands, could see it too. Doubt had grown into something larger. Suspicion got the morning began with Morton calling her final witnesses experts, analysts, all meant to reaffirm the strength of the evidence. They talked about fingerprints, about blood, about timelines. They sounded confident, but their words no longer carried the same punch. Because the defense had already planted the seed. If Carter had lied about his arrival, if the evidence logs were inconsistent, if his reports contradicted themselves, then how could anyone trust what the prosecution presented? Morton tried to tie it all together with her closing witnesses, but Maria saw it. The jurors weren't leaning in anymore. They were leaning back, arms crossed, their eyes sharper. They were questioning. And then it was Donnelly's turn. For all his weariness, for all his rumpled suits and coffee breath, the man rose that day with a steadiness Maria had never seen before. He called Carter back to the stand. Morton protested furiously, but the judge allowed it. Carter walked stiffly to the witness box, his jaw set, his eyes cold. Maria's heart pounded as Donnelly began. "Detective Carter," Donnelly said, his voice calm but sharp, "you testified that you arrived at the scene after receiving the call, correct?" "Yes," Carter said flatly. "And yet your original report states otherwise, that you arrived after other officers. Then later, you submitted a second version placing yourself first on scene. Which is it?" Carter's jaw tightened. "It was a correction." "A correction," Donnelly repeated. He walked slowly toward the jury, holding up the two reports side by side. "One version has you arriving later. The other puts you there first. That's not a correction, Detective. That's a rewrite." Morton objected, but the judge overruled. Donnelly pressed on. "And when you arrived first, as you now claim, you were seen near the couch where the towel was later discovered. Is that correct?" Carter shifted in his seat. "I was securing the scene." "Securing the scene," Donnelly echoed. He leaned in. "Or planting evidence?" the gallery gasped. Morton shot to her feet, shouting, but the damage was already done. Carter's face flushed, his composure slipping for the first time in public. He sputtered, "That's outrageous." Donnelly cut him off. "Outrageous? More outrageous than two conflicting reports? More outrageous than evidence logged before you claim to have found it? More outrageous than a witness seeing you handling something near the couch? Tell me, Detective, what's more outrageous, Lies, or the fact that my client has been sitting in a cell for months because of them. The courtroom was electric. The jury stared at Carter, their expressions unreadable but intense. Carter opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time, Maria saw it clearly. He was cornered. Donnelly ended his cross-examination with quiet finality. No further questions. The judge called a recess, and the courtroom erupted into whispers. Reporters scribbled frantically. Jurors exchanged glances. Carter sat rigid, his hands clenched, his mask shattered. Morton tried to gather the pieces, but everyone knew something had shifted. The case was no longer about Maria's supposed guilt. It was about Carter's undeniable lies. Closing arguments sealed it. Morton did her best to refocus the jury, to insist the evidence still pointed squarely at Maria, but her words rang hollow. Doubt had become too loud to silence. Then Donnelly rose for the final time. His voice was steady, his tone measured, but his words carried a weight that filled the room. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not about fingerprints or towels or timelines. It's about trust. It's about whether you believe that a woman, with no history of violence, suddenly snapped and committed a brutal crime, or whether you believe that a decorated officer, faced with his own mistakes, chose to cover them up at the expense of an innocent mother. You've seen the contradictions. You've seen the rewritten reports. You've seen the cracks in his story. If he lied about one thing, he could lie about all of it. And my client, Maria Jennings, has paid the price. Don't let her children grow up believing their mother is a killer when the truth is right in front of you. Don't let the badge blind you to justice. The jury deliberated for hours. Maria sat in the holding room, her hands trembling, her stomach churning, every tick of the clock like a hammer. She thought of her children, of the nights she had cried into her pillow, of the anonymous notes that had carried her this far. She thought of Carter, pacing somewhere, desperate to hold on to the last threads of his story. When the verdict finally came, the courtroom was packed to the walls. Maria stood, her knees weak, as the foreperson read the words she had prayed for, dreamed of, clung to in the darkest hours. Not guilty. The words echoed in her head, unreal, like a dream. Her knees buckled, and Donnelly caught her arm. Tears blurred her vision as she sank back into her chair, her body shaking with relief. The jury had seen through it. They had believed her. She was free. Carter's face was stone, but his eyes betrayed him. Rage, fear, defeat. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashed, and Maria sat there, trembling, her heart pounding with something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Carter was placed under investigation. Daniels came forward with more details. The anonymous ally later, revealed to be a clerk inside the department, gave testimony that sealed Carter's fate. He was charged with evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and perjury. For Maria, the nightmare was ending. She walked out of the courthouse into the sunlight, her children waiting for her, their arms wrapping around her in a hug that nearly brought her to her knees. The world felt new, alive, the air sharper and sweeter than she remembered. But freedom didn't erase the scars. The months in jail, the humiliation, the fear, it all lingered. She held her children tighter, vowing never to let anyone take them from her again. The system had nearly destroyed her, but she had survived. And survival, she realized, was its own kind of victory. Her story spread, not just in her town, but across the country. People debated it online, in forums, in living rooms. Some saw it as proof of systemic corruption, others as a cautionary tale about blind trust in authority. For Maria, it was simply her life, a wound that would take years to heal. But she told it anyway, because the truth mattered, because silence would have meant letting Carter win. And as her voice carried beyond the courtroom, beyond the headlines, it carried a message too. The fight for justice doesn't end with one verdict. It continues in every story told, every truth dragged into the light, every person who refuses to be silenced. Maria Jennings had been framed, broken, nearly destroyed. But she walked out stronger. And her story, like so many others, was a reminder that justice isn't just a word in a courtroom. It's a fight, one we all have to keep alive. If you followed her journey, if you felt the weight of her struggle, if you found yourself gripping the edge of your seat as the truth finally came out, don't let it end here. Share her story. Keep the fight for justice alive. And if you believe stories like Maria's need to be told, support them. Subscribe, like, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Because every voice, every action, every small piece of attention matters. Maria's fight was for her children, for her name, for her life. The next fight might be for someone you know.